Reggie had asked me to speak about, while he's getting it ready, looking at the Electricity Act and how smart grids, what needs to be done, what is there or isn't there. So it's a bad student who doesn't follow instructions, but as I've learned, it's some of my best students also who don't follow the instructions entirely. So I leave it to you to decide where it ends up. But the intent of what I'm going to present is not looking at all the aspects of regulation, but specifically look at the legislative points of view, from, especially the Electricity Act. The question becomes, do we need special regulations? And the global consensus is you may not need it, but it will certainly help. So, for example, in the United States, the Energy Independence and Security Act specifically talks about smart grids, and many countries talk not of smart grids, but of smart grid functionalities. So what they say is you need to offer a certain type of time of day tariff for consumers. Well, obviously you need to change the infrastructure to enable it. If you want, for example, rooftop solar, then you need a different type of meter with net metering capabilities. So very often the push towards smart grids is not by direct regulation, but by indirect regulation. So if you look at the language of Electricity Act 2003, it doesn't say the word smart grid anywhere. And neither do the national electricity plans, etc. So then the question becomes, now what? So if we come back to basics, there are two types of regulations. One is a cost plus, and the other is a purely competitive market. So it's unlikely that we will be in a purely competitive market anytime soon. So what's important is both the cost plus and a market still needs a regulator. The difference is, in a purely competitive market, the regulator doesn't set the prices, but they set the level playing field and the rules of the game such that competitive forces bring about the market. So the questions then become for any regulator is, what are allowable costs and what are the likely financial impacts, both positive and negative, for any smart grid deployment? And how we think about it, as a consumer would be, what does it mean for the tariff? So the good news and the bad news, as mentioned, is they don't mention smart grids. So that's bad that it doesn't have the support, but it's also good that we have now an opportunity ahead of us where we can really see what are the changes or tweaks or new directives that can really enable smart grids. And there are also, of course, many other acts of relevance, like the Electricity Regulatory Commissions Act, 1998, or the State State Electricity Regulatory Acts, which have a lot of wording which will actually become important, not just the Electricity Act 2003. So I don't expect you to read the details of the acts. The numbers are there and you'll have the things. But this slide really talks about who can supply. So the key words are, any generating company can set up without obtaining a license. And any person may construct, maintain, or operate a captive generating plant and dedicated transmission lines. But if you don't fall under one of these two categories, then you're not supposed to be in the generation or transmission business of electricity. So what does this mean now in terms of distributed generation? Now, assume that I don't have a company. Now, if I'm talking about rooftop solar, then perhaps all that's required is a feed-in tariff, and maybe that's a mechanism. Or it may be useful to update the law such that anyone can become a supplier even without incorporating. And now when we think about a smart grid, there's interesting futures where it's not about renewables, maybe it's about storage systems. Why could it not be that at a neighborhood, someone puts up a massive battery bank? If you look at battery technology today, the most cost-effective are not kilowatt scale, but 100 kilowatt or maybe megawatt class is what people are developing. So then you don't want it per consumer, you'd need it at a distributed level, low voltage level, but not necessarily at a household level. Can such a supplier / consumer of energy, a prosumer, actually participate under the Electricity Act? That needs clarity. At some point, we have a national target, 6 million electric vehicles. These are also going to be capable of supplying. If someone wants to participate not just in a demand response market, but as a purely competitive supplier, not part of demand response, then you are, for example, a virtual power plant. So you are, in some ways, acting like a supplier. So one of the suggestions is, let's decouple the statutory and operational, i.e. interconnection norms, so that we can have more and more participants without worrying about at what price can they participate. Because obviously, if somebody owns a diesel generator, people say that, hey, they can provide peaking power and support for the grid. Well, the price has to be right. Unless they get paid the, I don't know, 15, 16, 18 rupees a unit, they will not want to supply power, even peaking power, unless they're compensated. Tariffs. So this is where it's subjective. Essentially, it says tariffs shall be fixed from time to time. They will be fixed as per the Commission's rule and published in such a manner so as to give adequate publicity. Now, this is again an interesting thing, because we'll see in a second. And they shall not show undue preference to any person or class of persons, or discriminations against any person or class of persons. So it's a very fairness sort of a principle. But another point, but they shall, while they don't show undue preference, but they may differentiate according to the load factor, power factor, voltage, total consumption during any specified period, or at the time or the geographical position of the area, etc. So what we see is, tariff is really about principles. Today we have things like aggregate revenue requirement, cost to serve. These are limited because they are based without spatial or temporal granularity. They don't differentiate rural and urban with high granularity. They don't differentiate apartment buildings from a villa, even though the cost to serve is actually quite different. 500 consumers in a large apartment complex is much cheaper to serve than a house far away. Literally, some of these calculations take average numbers and divide. So if we think about a smart system, it is specifically about differentiation in a manner that promotes efficiency. Time of day is a classic example, but there's many others that could be done. So I think, this is a personal view, that we need to allow differentiation that is smarter, no pun intended, and which aligns microeconomic incentives. So let's use the word differentiate instead of discriminate. For example, today most consumers at the retail level are charged based on kilowatt hours without time of day. But it's not just time of day, it's grid conditions, congestion that could be also a factor, network externalities. Those are not part of traditional rate calculations. So time of use is actually allowed explicitly. The electricity plan allows it, and even the Act hints at time of day. It doesn't say go do a time of day tariff. It says that in a manner that's appropriate. So the question becomes, how do we do the time of day? Now, one of the things is interpretation. How do you publicize a real-time tariff? Well, if it's a market-based real-time tariff, you don't know what the tariff will be. So that would be a failure of complying with the Act. So real-time needs some level of thinking how we deal with it. So the suggestion is, let's rethink of tariffs such that they can be both granular and dynamic, while at the same time having principles of simplicity and transparency and fairness. So rate base. The Act says that essentially the utility can recover any costs reasonably incurred, again, interpretation, providing any electric line or electrical plant used for the purpose of giving that supply. So does this mean investments for a smart grid could be considered part of the electrical plant? So instead of getting into the details, I don't think the regulators should necessarily specify how to treat smart grid investments. Instead, clarify a methodology for which investments are to be allowed. Some technical specifics, that there shall be codes. Reggie, sorry. How much time, sorry? 2 minutes, okay. Do we actually have such codes specified for intervals of billing? So instead of specifying how you connect or disconnect, maybe the utilities should be allowed to propose new alternatives, because a smart grid isn't about X or Y. It's an enabling infrastructure for doing what we want. So instead of thinking disconnection and connection, maybe if somebody's not paying their bill, the utility could curtail them instead of disconnecting them. So these are new thinkings that really the legislation or regulations should enable. So in closing, the devil is in the details. Now a few points that are missing. It was easy to show the act and say what it means or doesn't mean. Now what's missing? How do we determine the peak off-peak differential? 10 paise, 10%? It really matters. How do we allocate costs? So if there's an investment, how much is a smart grid investment? How much is a infrastructure investment? Because the rates of return may be different, the funding sources may be different. So how do we allocate costs? How are pilots to be treated? That is a challenge, because literally with one utility we were working with the regulator, and we asked, can we try this pilot? And the answer, what one regulator gave was, let them make a tariff petition and we'll decide. Well, a pilot need not be about a tariff change. It's a pilot, it's experimental. So can we do it? Should it be voluntary or mandatory? How do we protect stakeholders from undue risk in a pilot? How are costs and benefits to be handled? One of the things missing from our principles is most calculations today are done on return on investment. There's a cost, investment, and a return. But instead of return on investment, there is also a societal cost benefit that may be missing. So for example, if you avoid diesel usage, the consumer benefits, 15 rupees a unit. Does the utility get anything from that? As of now, no. But we need principles that allow them to share the benefits, for example, from a societal, and then do appropriate transfers such that the utility is kept not only whole, but they should be given equivalent rate of return as their other investments as well. So what we really need, as that example shows, is an alignment of the economic incentives. As you know, I mentioned in this example, conservation is a challenge. If a consumer consumes less energy and they're a paying customer, commercial and industrial, the utility could be worse off. So we need mechanisms where saving energy also saves money for all the stakeholders that are involved. Other things that are not spoken about in the Act, they need not be, but then through directives or rulings, we need clarity on risks and rewards. Otherwise, are people rewarded for overly risky behavior because it'll all get passed through? Or are they punished for taking risks because then it gets disallowed? Choosing technologies is another area. People have an assumption. They interpret laws to mean lowest cost bid is the only way to choose technologies, but that's not true. The law actually says you want the best value for citizens. However, state laws have actually mandated bidding with L1, L2. So the catch is we need a life cycle mechanism to look at true costs, and for pilots especially, going for a bid only at the lowest cost may not be the best route, because we're really at a learning stage where we want the technology to succeed. That's more important than saving 5% cost, because let's be honest, a cost of a pilot will always be higher than the long-term cost. So now worrying about saving a small percentage on a large per unit cost doesn't seem to make sense. So the suggestion is we should allow exotic and innovative tariffs in pilot areas without going through the traditional tariff setting procedures. Add societal cost benefit analysis to the methodology instead of merely investor return on investment. So in conclusion, I think we have not yet had rulings or regulation for smart grids except Maharashtra, which is a front runner, and now maybe Gujarat as well. But we need all India examples and maybe central help and support for these. So I think the only way forward is iterative. Let's experiment and take it forward. Thank you.